me right now, and this didn't come up for me when we recorded Contributors Corner. I'm very vocal about I'm a person in long-term recovery from alcohol and substance use disorder. I don't shy away from talking about that. I've been known to admit that I hang out in church basements. And as a woman who has sponsored many women and taken them through a 12-step program, that is an area where I learned to say no a lot, because there it was really important for both me and the person that I was sponsoring that boundaries were in place. And I was not good at it at the beginning at all. I became really aware of how codependent I was, and that wasn't helping anyone. And so I definitely feel like in the last 5 to 7 years, when I look at the different relationships I've had of sponsoring women and being like, this is how I do things. And you said you're willing to follow directions. You either are or you're not going to do what you say you're going to do. I'm not going to change the rules for you. And so if you don't, that's fine. We just won't work together. And I just hold the line, hold the line, hold the line. And so I've definitely gotten practice in that area for sure. I think parenting gives you practice in defining boundaries and saying no. I'm really working with my dogs on boundaries and not jumping up and being like, no, no, But and for me, I think that saying no in the workplace was a big struggle to get over. And for me, it took a health crisis of being a complete workaholic and working myself into the hospital over it to realize I have to start saying no to things. I can't be everyone to every, and I don't need to, because that's just ego when I am being like that, right? So it just takes a lot of practice. And I think the first step is, quite honestly, being honest with yourself. Like, I'm not going to tell someone, oh, I really wish I could, if I don't wish I could, right? I can just say, I'm not available. Thanks for thinking of me. Not available. And they don't need, I don't owe them an explanation. Right. And I got a lot of this mentoring from Kristen Graham. She became a mentor to me before we became best friends. And as I was moving up through senior leadership in the companies that I was at, and she was the one that told me, you don't have to say yes to everything. And I was like, I don't. I think especially as women, we think that we're raised to be these good little girls that like mind our P's and Q's and do everything we're told and make sure our hair looks right and make sure we smile. And, that's just a bunch of bullshit. Like that, it doesn't need to be that way. And so I learned to say no, but then I was making a lot of excuses. And you don't need to do that either. Like, less is actually more. You don't owe people an entire explanation as to what your reasoning is. You don't even have to have a reason, right? So I don't know if you got anything out of that.
I like it because you politely acknowledge the offer by saying thank you. That's really nice of you to ask, but I'm not available. I love that phrase, Alysse, I'm not available, because I think a normal person isn't going to press you and say, oh, what do you mean you're not available? What do you have going that night or whatever? I think a normal person would just kind of let it sit. And if they do push you, it's like, you don't owe them anything. I'm sorry, I'm not available.
Right.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
What about, I'm curious about, one thing that I think all of us have seen and probably experienced to an extent in, outside of WORKP2P, a company dedicated to redeeming work, a lot of companies take advantage of the fact that people are afraid to say no. And so they'll overwork you. They'll maybe impose unrealistic deadlines so that you have to work 12 hours a day until you get the project done. What have you all experienced when it comes to saying no in the work world, in the context of work? Anybody have anything? And what was that like? I'll give an example that I lived through in broadcasting. And I think I may have told this story before, so I'll make it not a super long story. But when I first started as a journalist in Spokane, I wanted to become an anchor. And my news director came to me and said, hey, we've got a weekend anchor position open. And I wouldn't have seen my wife if I had been working on the weekend. So I declined. I said no. And the news director was shocked by that because those are hard to get. And it ended up all working out. And I think, I ended up getting a morning anchor position a few months later, which is Monday through Friday. And I think it goes hand in hand with what you were saying, Alysse, that hand in glove to saying yes or no are boundaries. And we have to really define those boundaries before we get into these situations so that we're not on our heels kind of thinking, well, should I do this? Should I not do this? If we have a clear understanding of what's important and where our boundaries are, then the yes and no becomes, I think, a lot easier.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, one of the struggles I had at my last job was I'm an idea person, I'm a gregarious person. And so when I'm up, man, I'll bring the whole room up with me. But it's not realistic for me to be up all the time. And I'm not a vending machine. You can't come up and like push my nose and I spew out creativity ideas. Like sometimes I'm really good on the fly. And then people experience that and they expect it all the time. And so that became a struggle for me, especially as someone who deals with depression. It's not realistic for me to be up and energized and super smiley all the time. And it's also shouldn't be a requirement of my job to be that all the time. Like I have to always get the job done. That's what I'm getting compensated for. But I don't have to always do it with, pom poms in my hand and doing cartwheels. And so that can be really hard to manage other people's expectations of what they think that you should be, because sometimes you are that way, but other times you're not. That can be really
Yeah.
challenging.
Anybody else have a work experience of saying no or regretting not saying no?
No, I feel like there's projects that I have been willing to take on. And even though the project was really cool to learn, and it was once we were done that project, it felt good to get it done. But in the moment, it was saying yes to something where I knew that it was over my bandwidth. I knew that this would be, involve me working extra hours, and which I'm always willing to do. But I'm grateful that we work for someone who wants us to oscillate, right? Who wants us to we get the job done, but it's also you have to rest because or else you're not useful. And, saying yes to those types of projects, it just decreases my productivity with everything else that I do. And so I think it's, I get excited about projects whenever there's anything new. I do need to learn how to set, okay, I don't have the bandwidth currently, but this is what I can do if it's something I'm excited about. It's a no right now, but maybe a yes later kind of thing. I think that's what I need to learn how to manage a little bit better.
Thanks, Tamar. Libby, what about you?
You know, a couple of things come to mind. The first is that for the majority of my career, I have worked in cultures where it was expected that you would do certain things outside of your typical hours, your salary. So, whatever, your hours technically don't really count, but it was expected that you would do certain things that aren't in your job description. And if you didn't, people were annoyed with you. They kind of like, well, you felt like you were going to get in trouble. Thought I might get fired, or something bad would happen, which was a little dramatic. But so I really did spend, that was, really my experience with feeling like you should be able to say no, but not saying no because you didn't want to not look like a team player or have everybody talking shit about you when you don't help after the event or something. But I also want to admit that I am guilty of also asking people to do things that I were not in their, like I was someone who would be annoyed with someone who didn't say yes to whatever it was. And the older it took, it really was steeped in that first like big job culture. That's just what was ingrained in me, that like we're all on the same team, we all do everything, we all help with everything, you never say no. And it took, years of people saying no to stuff for my mindset to really shift from they're not a team player, they're like, that's really lame that they're not going to do this, to like, well, they don't have to do this. Like, this isn't in their job contract. This isn't written into their hiring paperwork or something. Like, they don't have to volunteer their time to do these certain things out of obligation if they have other things that they, would rather do. So guilty of not saying no and also guilty of mentally shunning people who said no to me. But I'm better now. I promise, guys. You can say no to me.